The heat in Harmony Creek was a physical weight. It settled in the thick dust of the main street, shimmered above the warped planks of the boardwalk, and baked the false fronts of the general store and the land office until the paint blistered. Inside the Gilded Rooster Saloon, the air was a thick stew of sweat, cheap whiskey, and stale cigar smoke, but at least it was loud. The noise was a shield against the oppressive quiet of the plains, a boisterous declaration of life against the vast, empty canvas of the Arizona Territory. At the center of the noise was the annual shooting contest. A thick oak plank, scarred with the marks of previous years, was propped against the far wall. 6 empty whiskey bottles were perched on top, glinting in the lantern light. The prize was a $20 gold piece and a year's worth of bragging rights, which, in a town like Harmony Creek, was worth more than the gold. Bart Corrigan, the town blacksmith whose arms were as thick as tree limbs, had just finished his turn. He holstered his smoking Remington with a flourish, a smug grin splitting his beard. 5 of the 6 bottles lay in shards on the floor. The crowd roared its approval, slapping his broad back as he swaggered to the bar. "Anyone think they can beat that?" Bart bellowed, his voice a gravelly rumble. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a slight figure nursing a warm beer in the corner. Silas Blackwood. Silas was a ranch hand from the Miller property, a man more comfortable with horses than with people. He had a quiet demeanor and a way of moving that seemed to apologize for the space he occupied. He wasn't a fighter or a braggart. He was just Silas, the man who could calm a spooked mare with a soft word and a steady hand. "How about you, Blackwood?" Bart taunted, a cruel glint in his eye. "Heard you carry that old colt of your pa's. Ever figure out which end the bullet comes out of?" A wave of laughter rippled through the saloon. Silas's face burned, and he shrank further into the shadows. He had no intention of participating. His father's peacemaker was a keepsake, not a tool. He'd practiced with it a few times out in the canyons, but his shots were more likely to scare a coyote than hit a tin can. But Finn, the young stable hand who idolized Silas for his way with animals, clapped him on the shoulder. "Go on, Silas. Show 'em." Finn's encouragement was earnest but misplaced, born of a boy's ignorance of a man's pride. All eyes were on him now. To refuse would be to confirm Bart's taunt. To accept was to invite certain humiliation. Trapped, Silas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. With a slow, reluctant nod, he rose and walked toward the firing line. The saloon fell into a hushed, anticipatory silence. Someone handed him the saloon's well-worn Colt, its grip smooth and foreign in his sweaty palm. He stood before the last set of 6 bottles, the weight of every gaze pressing down on him. He raised the pistol, his hand trembling so violently that the front sight danced a wild jig around the first bottle. He took a shaky breath, closed one eye, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the silence. A splinter of wood flew from the wall, a good 2 feet to the left of the target. A few snickers broke the tension. Silas swallowed hard, recocked the hammer, and aimed again. The second shot sent a puff of dust from the floorboards below the plank. The snickers grew into open chuckles. He fired again, and again. The third shot shattered a lantern on the wall to the right. The fourth gouged a line in the ceiling. The fifth buried itself in the bar near Bart's elbow, making the blacksmith jump back with a curse. The sixth and final shot was the worst. In his haste and shame, he flinched hard, and the bullet whined harmlessly into the back wall without disturbing so much as a dust mote near the bottles. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then Bart Corrigan let out a roar of laughter that shook the room. The entire saloon erupted with him, a tidal wave of mockery that crashed over Silas. Cries of "clumsyfoot" and "couldn't hit a barn from the inside" filled the air. Silas stood frozen, the heavy pistol limp in his hand, his face a mask of scarlet shame. He could feel their ridicule like a physical blow. Without a word, he set the gun down on the bar and pushed his way through the jeering crowd, fleeing the saloon and the sound of his own failure. The sting of mockery was a stubborn ghost, clinging to Silas long after he'd fled the saloon's raucous laughter. It followed him through the cool night and was still there to greet him in the pre-dawn chill. He found his only solace in the familiar rhythm of work at the Miller Ranch. The air, crisp and smelling of hay and damp earth, was a balm to his shredded nerves. Here, his hands didn't tremble. As he ran a brush down the flank of a gentle mare named Daisy, his movements were sure, his touch confident. The horses didn't judge him for his aim. They responded only to his patience and his quiet, steady presence. "Morning, Silas," Silas started, turning to see Mr. Miller leaning against the stable door, a tin cup of coffee steaming in his gnarled hands. He was a man carved from the land itself, with kind eyes crinkled by years of sun and hard work. "Mr. Miller," Silas mumbled, his gaze dropping to the dusty floor. "Heard there was some excitement in town yesterday," Miller said, his tone casual, betraying no hint of judgment. He took a slow sip of coffee. "Daisy's coat is looking fine. You have a way with them, a quiet strength. Some folks don't recognize that kind of strength because it doesn't make a lot of noise." The words were a lifeline. Silas felt the tight knot in his chest loosen just a fraction. He didn't have to explain or defend himself. Mr. Miller saw his worth where it mattered, here in the sweat and silence of honest labor. "Thank you, sir," he managed to say, the words thick with unspoken gratitude. Later that afternoon, Mr. Miller sent him into town for a sack of oats and some leather oil. The dread of facing the townspeople was a cold stone in his gut, but a job was a job. He kept his head down as he walked his horse down the main street, the dust swirling around his worn boots. The memory of the saloon was everywhere, in the way a man chuckled as he passed, in the whisper of two women behind their hands. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, each one a fresh reminder of his failure. Just as he was tying his horse outside the general store, a frantic drumming of hooves shattered the afternoon quiet. A lone rider, wild-eyed and drenched in sweat, thundered into town, his horse gasping for air. He pulled the animal to a skidding halt, nearly tumbling from the saddle. "They're coming," the man yelled, his voice raw with panic. "The Red Scorpions. They hit Crimson Ridge, burned it, they took everything." A crowd gathered instantly, faces turning from curiosity to alarm. Silas lingered at the edge, frozen in place. Bart Corrigan pushed his way to the front, his barrel chest puffed out. "Crimson Ridge is a good 2 days' ride from here," Bart scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. "Not the way they ride," the messenger choked out. "They're led by a devil named Jedediah Kane. They don't stop. They're heading this way. We heard them talking something about Harmony Creek's bank." The word bank sent a fresh wave of fear through the crowd. A woman gasped. "But Sheriff Thompson, he's gone to the state capitol. He's not due back for a week." The news hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Harmony Creek was defenseless. The panic began to curdle into grim realization. Bart, ever the opportunist, seized the moment to reassert his dominance. "Let 'em come," he bellowed, looking around for approval. "We've got men here who can shoot straight. We'll give 'em a welcome they won't forget." He shot a deliberate, sneering look directly at Silas. "Don't worry, folks. We won't be relying on the likes of 6 Miss Silas to protect us." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but they were hollow, thin. The joke had lost its humor. The threat wasn't a bottle on a fence post anymore. It was real, it was violent, and it was coming for them. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. He wasn't thinking of his shame anymore. He was thinking of the cold, hard fact that his town was vulnerable, and the only man who could do anything about it was him. A man who couldn't hit the broad side of a barn. The swinging doors of the Harmony Creek Saloon, which had mocked Silas with their boisterous laughter just days before, now flapped open and closed with a frantic, nervous energy. Inside, the air was thick not with cigar smoke and cheap whiskey, but with the suffocating stench of fear. Mayor Thompson, a portly man whose face was slick with sweat, stood on a crate, his voice cracking as he tried to rally the townsfolk. The meeting was a chaotic storm of shouted suggestions and panicked arguments. "We should barricade the main street, block it with every wagon we've got," one man yelled. "And trap ourselves like rats? No, we need to meet them in the open." Another countered, his voice more bravado than belief. Into this vortex of uncertainty strode Bart Corrigan. He pushed his way to the front, chest puffed out, hands resting near the pistol on his hip as if he'd been born to command. "Settle down, all of you," he boomed, his voice silencing the room. "Panicking is what they want. What we need is a clear plan and a man who ain't afraid to lead it." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "We'll do as Henderson said. We'll barricade the entrance to town. When Kane and his scorpions ride in, we'll be waiting for them on the rooftops. A wall of lead. They won't know what hit them." It was a simple, brutal plan, and in their terror, the townspeople clung to its perceived strength. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Silas stood near the back, a shadow by the doorway. The plan felt wrong, a reckless invitation for a bloodbath. He knew from the rider's tale that the Red Scorpions didn't just ride in the front gate. They were known for flanking, for using chaos to their advantage. They would expect a direct defense. He cleared his throat, his voice barely a whisper. "What about the alley behind the Mercantile, or the low fence near the livery?" Every head turned. Bart's eyes narrowed, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. The town sharpshooter." A wave of harsh laughter filled the saloon, cutting Silas deeper than any insult had before. "You planning on scaring them off by missing, Blackwood? We're talking about a real fight, not a county fair contest. Leave the thinking to the men who can actually handle a gun." Shame burned Silas's cheeks red. He shrank back, the weight of their derision pressing him out the door and into the fading afternoon light. He didn't retreat to the ranch this time. Instead, propelled by a cold, quiet anger, he began to walk. His steps were measured, his eyes scanning not the ground in front of him, but the town itself. He saw it not as his home, but as a battlefield. He paced the alley Bart had dismissed, noting its narrowness, a perfect choke point. He walked the perimeter, tracing the weak spots in the fences, the dark, unlit corners between buildings where men could hide. He remembered stories his father, a trapper who'd seen his share of trouble on the plains, used to tell. "Never fight where your enemy expects you to," the old man had said, "and never mistake noise for strength." The noise from the saloon was a hollow roar. Up on the hill, the church steeple stood silent, a lone sentinel. From there, Silas realized, you could see every approach to Harmony Creek. You could see an enemy long before they saw you. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, Silas stood at the edge of town, looking back. The saloon was a beacon of loud, misguided courage. Out here, in the quiet, a different kind of plan was taking root in his mind. A plan built not on bravado, but on the silent, patient wisdom of the overlooked. The following morning, Harmony Creek was a hive of frantic, misguided activity. Under Bart Corrigan's booming commands, men were dragging barrels and furniture into the main street, constructing a crude barricade in front of the saloon. The sound of hammers echoed off the wooden storefronts, a noisy proclamation of the town's defiance. But to Silas, watching from the edge of the Miller property, it sounded like men nailing their own coffins shut. He saw the gaps in their logic as clearly as the gaps in the barricade itself. They were creating a funnel, a kill box, with no thought to the flanking routes he'd identified the night before. The narrow alley between the general store and the assier's office. The wide, undefended rear entrance to the livery stable. Bart was preparing for a fistfight on an open field, not an ambush in a town full of angles and shadows. His heart pounded with a familiar, sickening rhythm of anxiety and frustration. Shouting at them again would be useless. He'd just be the town fool crying wolf. He needed someone to listen, not with their pride, but with their reason. His gaze settled on the Miller ranch house. Mr. Miller was a quiet man, deliberate and fair. He valued hard work and common sense over loud talk. He had employed Silas for 5 years, and while he'd never said much, his trust was implied in the responsibilities he gave him. It was a long shot, but it was the only one he had. He found Mr. Miller by the barn, methodically sharpening a scythe, his movements economical and precise. He didn't look up as Silas approached, but his hands stilled. "They're making a lot of noise down there," Mr. Miller said, his voice a low rumble. "Yes, sir," Silas replied, his own voice barely a whisper. He cleared his throat. "Sir, they're going to get themselves killed." Miller finally looked up. His eyes, weathered by years under the sun, were sharp and discerning. "You think so?" Silas took a breath, forcing himself to speak clearly, to lay out the cold logic he'd pieced together during his sleepless night. "They've blocked the main street, but the red scorpions won't come down the main street. They'll split up. 2 or 3 men will slip through the west alley, another group will come through the back of the livery. They'll have the town surrounded before anyone behind that barricade fires a single shot. Corrigan's men will be trapped between the Outlaws and the buildings." He described the low rooftops that offered perfect sightlines down onto the street, the stacked crates behind the general store that provided easy cover for an attack from the rear. He wasn't talking about courage or marksmanship. He was talking about terrain and tactics, the same way he'd talk about managing cattle or anticipating a storm. Mr. Miller listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on Silas, his expression unreadable. When Silas finished, a heavy silence hung between them. Mr. Miller ran a thumb over the freshly sharpened blade of the scythe. "I saw you at that contest, son," he said quietly. "You're no gunman." The words stung, but they were true. "No, sir, I'm not," Silas admitted, his shoulders slumping. "But I can see where a fence is weak. I can see where the wolves will try to get into the pen. This is no different." Mr. Miller stared past him, toward the sounds of hammering from the town. He nodded slowly, a single decisive motion. "What do you need?" Relief washed over Silas so powerfully he felt lightheaded. "Rope," he said quickly, his mind racing. "Lanterns, oil, and any spare metal you have. Old pots, pans, anything that will make a noise." Mr. Miller didn't ask why. He simply pointed to the supply shed. "Take what you need. And Silas," he added, as Silas turned to go, "be careful. A fool with a plan is still a fool, but he's a fool with followers." As the town's defenders focused their efforts on their grand, useless fortress, Silas worked in the shadows. He moved through the silent alleyways and behind the deserted buildings, a ghost in his own town. In the dark passage beside the general store, he stretched a thin tripwire a few inches off the ground, connecting it to a precariously balanced pyramid of old tin cans. At the livery's wide rear entrance, he didn't build a wall. He placed several lanterns, their wicks soaked in oil, in the hay-strewn corners, ready to be lit. He wasn't building a defense to stop the red scorpions. He was building an alarm system to tell him exactly where they were. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the vast Montana sky in hues of fiery orange and deep purple. Long, distorted shadows stretched from the buildings of Harmony Creek, making the familiar streetscape seem alien and menacing. A cold wind began to whisper through the town, carrying the scent of dust and fear. On Main Street, Bart Corrigan's barricade was complete. It was a chaotic assembly of overturned carts, barrels, and stacked crates, a monument to panicked bravado. Behind it, a dozen men clutched their rifles, their faces grim in the fading light. They tried to project an image of steadfast resolve, but their darting eyes and stiff postures betrayed a deep, gnawing anxiety. Bart paced behind the makeshift wall, his voice a low growl as he gave last-minute instructions. "Keep your eyes peeled. They'll try to come at us head-on, just like I said. We'll be ready for 'em. Nobody gets past this line." His confidence, so booming in the saloon, now had a brittle edge to it. The reality of the coming violence was beginning to settle in, a heavy weight in the chilling air. Unseen, on the opposite side of town, Silas moved like one of the deepening shadows. He crouched in the narrow alley between the general store and the blacksmith's shop, his fingers deftly tying the last knot on a thin, dark cord. The cord ran from a fence post, barely ankle-high, to a precariously balanced stack of old tin cans on a window ledge. It was crude, but it was effective. Any horse or man blundering through the alley in the dark would send the cans clattering to the ground, an alarm no one could miss. He had set up 3 such systems, covering the most obvious blind spots he'd identified. He rose and dusted off his hands, his face a mask of calm focus. He wasn't thinking about courage or cowardice. He was thinking about angles, sound, and the element of surprise. He glanced back towards Main Street, where the lanterns being lit at the barricade created a pool of defiant light, a perfect target for anyone approaching in the dark. He shook his head slightly. As he slipped out of the alley's mouth, he came face to face with Bart, who was making a final, swaggering tour of the town's perimeter. Bart stopped short, a sneer twisting his lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Find a good cellar to hide in, Blackwood?" He jeered, his voice loud enough for the men at the barricade to hear. A few of them chuckled nervously. Silas didn't answer. He simply met Bart's gaze for a brief moment, his expression unreadable, before turning and melting back into the shadows towards the Miller Ranch on the edge of town. His silence seemed to infuriate Bart more than any retort could have. "That's right, you run. When the shooting starts, the real men will be the ones standing." An hour passed. The purple sky deepened to a starless, inky black. A suffocating silence descended upon Harmony Creek, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind and the creak of a saloon sign. Every window was dark. The men at the barricade had stopped talking, their ears straining against the quiet. The entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Then it came. At first, it was a feeling more than a sound, a low, rhythmic vibration in the hard-packed earth. It grew subtly, a distant thrumming that could be mistaken for a nervous heartbeat. But it didn't fade. It grew stronger, steadier. The thrum became a sound, the unmistakable, synchronized pounding of horses' hooves. It wasn't the sound of a lone rider or a small posse. It was the sound of a small army moving with purpose in the darkness. On the horizon, a single, moving light appeared, a lantern held by a scout. The Red Scorpions were here. The sound of hooves stopped abruptly just beyond the edge of town, plunging Harmony Creek back into a tense, suffocating silence. The men at the barricade held their breath, knuckles white on their rifles. Out of the darkness, a single rider emerged, moving at a slow, deliberate walk. He was a tall man, draped in a long dust coat, his face shadowed by the wide brim of his hat. He reined his horse to a halt 100 feet from the makeshift wall of barrels and carts, his posture radiating an unnerving calm. This was Jedediah Kane. He surveyed the barricade, his head tilting slightly. A low chuckle, dry as dust, carried on the night air. He didn't need to shout. His presence was command enough. He raised a gloved hand and made a simple, circling gesture. From the darkness on either side, his gang materialized, not in a clumsy rush, but with the fluid efficiency of practiced hunters. Bart Corrigan, slick with sweat, gripped his rifle tighter. "Hold your nerve, boys. They try to rush us, we fill 'em with lead," he hissed, his voice a half-octave too high. But Kane had no intention of rushing. He saw the barricade for the amateurish trap it was. He gestured to two of his men, pointing them toward the dark, narrow alley between the general store and the blacksmith's shop. The men dismounted, their movements quiet and swift, melting into the shadows. They were flanking them. From his perch in the hayloft of the livery stable, Silas watched, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. This was the moment. The alley the two outlaws slipped into was the one he'd prepared first. He saw their dark shapes move past the first rain barrel, then the second. His breath hitched as one of them brushed against the thin, nearly invisible wire stretched ankle-high across the path. The resulting sound was not a gunshot, but a sudden, violent cacophony. A rope yanked taut, and a heavy sack of empty tin cans and scrap metal, suspended from the blacksmith's awning, came crashing down onto the corrugated tin roof below. The metallic explosion was shockingly loud, a deafening clatter and screech that ripped the night apart. The two outlaws yelled in surprise, stumbling back into the main street as if flushed from cover. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. At the barricade, Bart's men flinched violently, spinning around toward the source of the noise. "Where did that come from?" someone shouted. "They're behind us," another cried in panic. Bart was completely paralyzed. His entire plan had been predicated on a simple, head-on assault. This was something else. His eyes darted from the impassive figure of Kane to the alley where the noise had erupted. "Hold the line," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "Stay at your posts." But his authority had evaporated. His men were looking at each other, their faces etched with fear and confusion. The enemy wasn't where he'd told them they would be. Their flimsy wall suddenly felt like a cage. Kane's horse shifted, and he let out another humorless laugh. The ambush was blown, but the town's defense was clearly in chaos. His men drew their pistols, sensing the shift in momentum. The fear wafting from the barricade was thick enough to taste. They were ready to capitalize on the panic. Watching from the shadows, Silas knew this was the critical juncture. The alarm had worked perfectly, sowing confusion and shattering Bart's fragile command. But confusion was temporary. In another minute, Kane's men would recover and tear through the panicked townsfolk. He had to press the advantage. He reached for the small, covered lantern at his side, the one he'd arranged with Mr. Miller. Taking a steadying breath, he slid the cover open 3 times in quick succession. A trio of faint, yellow pulses blinked into the darkness, a silent signal aimed toward the back window of Miller's mercantile. It was time for Phase 2. The frantic ringing of the bell was Silas's cue. From his perch on the shadowed roof of the general store, he lifted a small lantern with a green-tinted glass shutter and flashed it twice toward the far end of town. The signal was received almost instantly. A sudden, crackling roar erupted from near the livery stable, not gunfire, but a string of firecrackers, loud and chaotic enough to mimic a full-blown skirmish. The disoriented red scorpions, already unnerved by the tripwire, flinched at the new sound. They were being hit from 2 sides. Before they could regroup, a new sound joined the cacophony. A low, rumbling thunder that grew louder with each second. Mr. Miller, following Silas's instructions, had unlatched the cattle pens. A wave of terrified livestock poured into the side street, a dusty, unstoppable torrent of horns and hooves that effectively sealed off the Outlaws' western flank. The street became a maelstrom of panicked animals and cursing men. Jedediah Kane, his face a mask of fury in the moonlight, saw his carefully planned raid dissolving into chaos. He barked orders, trying to rally his men, but his voice was swallowed by the din. Silas had anticipated this. He knew a cornered man seeks the quietest escape. He had left one path clear: the narrow, dark alley between the general store and the blacksmith's forge. It looked like a natural funnel, an escape from the noise and the stampede. As predicted, Kane shoved 2 of his men toward it. "Go, find a way out," he yelled. 3 more followed, drawn by the promise of safety. It was a trap laid not with steel, but with psychology. As Kane and his 5 remaining men entered the alley, a heavy gate, previously propped open, was swung shut behind them by 2 of Miller's ranch hands. At the other end, Mr. Miller himself appeared, flanked by the blacksmith and the livery owner, all holding rifles. They didn't fire, they simply stood, blocking the exit. The red scorpions were boxed in. "Jedediah Kane," a quiet voice called from above. Kane and his men looked up. There, silhouetted against the starry sky, was Silas Blackwood. He wasn't holding a rifle, just a simple Colt revolver, held loosely at his side. He wasn't aiming it, he didn't need to. "You were led here," Silas said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the fading noise. "Every move you made tonight, we knew you would make. You saw the barricade on Main Street and thought us fools. You tried to flank us, and you walked right into our welcome." Kane's eyes darted from the blocked exit in front to the shut gate behind, then back up at the young man on the roof. His mind, quick and tactical, was processing the inescapable truth. He had been played, outmaneuvered completely. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Just a ranch hand," Silas replied. "But I know this town. I know its alleys, its weaknesses, and its strengths. Your raid is over. You can die here in this alley, or you can drop your guns and ride away when the sun comes up." Meanwhile, across town, Bart Corrigan stood frozen behind his magnificent, useless barricade. He had watched Silas's plan unfold with a mixture of terror and shame. His own men had abandoned their posts, either to see the commotion or to help Miller's group. He was alone, his bravado stripped away, leaving only a hollow, pathetic shell. The man he had called a coward had just saved them all without firing a shot in anger. Back in the alley, Kane weighed his options. A bloody fight he couldn't win, or the humiliation of retreat. He was a ruthless outlaw, but he wasn't a fool. With a curse that echoed off the brick walls, he threw his pistol to the ground. One by one, his men followed suit. The fight was over. As the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink, the disarmed red scorpions were marched out of town. The townsfolk emerged from their homes, not with cheers, but with a quiet, profound sense of relief. Their eyes didn't seek out Bart, who was trying to disappear into the shadows. They looked at Silas, who was now on the ground, calmly speaking with Mr. Miller. He hadn't become a gunslinger overnight. He was still the man who had missed every shot in the saloon. But they now understood that courage wasn't about hitting a target, but about seeing the whole board and having the nerve to make the right move.